Welcome, everyone. Wonderful to have you here with us today. Today, we're going to be looking at the early years new framework, and absolutely delighted to be joined by Pam Mundy.
Good afternoon, everyone.
And Jacob's going to be popping in a bit later.
Hello, everyone.
So what we're doing here today is really previewing the new early years framework. We're trying to look at it at an executive level. What's the overall or the overarching aims of it? Where we're trying to get to? And this is a preview for a later webinar that we'll be running, which will be right into the practical details. That's much more of a training one. But you've got the chat box there, so please say where you're from, which organisation you're from. We'll have people from all over the world. That's great. But the focus today is just on the early years framework, and it does have implications for all different countries. And then if you've got any questions or thoughts, just put those up and I'll be putting those to Pam as we go along and we try and unpick it, so we get a kind of really good strategic overview. So without more ado then, Pam, strategic overview. What was the aim of this? Why did we start off with this new early years framework? What was wrong with the old one from the start with?
Well, it's a very good question, actually, Stephen, and many people have asked that question. And it's really interesting. As soon as someone mentions change, everybody looks at what's existing and says, actually, no, we did quite like it. It was fine. But in fairness, there's a huge amount of good stuff in the existing framework and in the profile and in the supporting documents. And I know people all over the world have used this document, sometimes in British international schools, sometimes international schools, and of course across the UK. We say UK, but of course Scotland has its own and Wales has its own version as well. But I think I have to say, I think there was a feeling that it was time for it to be updated, time to add in some things that perhaps weren't there before. And if I give you the flip side of that, there were also, I guess, the reason to look at joining the curricula together. Because transition between reception and year one, or FS2 and grade one, wherever you are in the world, that's always been a slightly contentious issue. Nobody ever seems to get that absolutely right, and it's always a worry. I think people have worried a great deal about the profile itself and about the fact that there was the emerging, expected and exceeding levels, and people found those very difficult to judge. And also, I think, it's a refresh across the piece and to bring fresh eyes to it. So I guess not all of it has been positively received, and I'll explain that to you as we go through the session. But time for a refresh, time for something new. And actually, if everyone listening just holds on to this piece, which is also there's a moment in time here between the old and the new for nurseries and for schools to say, right, now we can really focus in on the kind of practice that we believe in. We've got a new framework, and while everyone is allowing us to get used to it, this is our chance to do what we have always wanted to do. So if I said nothing else tonight, I'd want people to go away knowing that this is your tool in your hands. It's not something that's going to drive you into a particular mode of practice.
Okay, that's a really helpful start. So in typical kind of English UK fashion, and I'll put it either way, we tend to stuff more in rather than take more out. Is that what's happened here? We got more going in, or we got less?
No, actually, let's just think about the main documents first of all. So there's the early years framework itself, which is the overview, the programs for learning. It's got the learning goals in it. There's also the development guidance, and I will talk about what they've replaced. And there's also the early years profile. Now, what it did make me laugh, actually, to be fair. The development matters, the development guidance this time is 20% shorter than the old one. Now, not entirely sure that might be a good thing. The fact that the early learning goals aren't indicated in it might be the actual reduction piece. So it's shorter in terms of length. And the idea is that it reduces bureaucracy for schools, particularly in terms of the assessment pieces. Again, I'm not entirely sure that's going to be the case because, of course, we have a reception baseline coming in as well, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So the intention is that it's shorter, and many people were absolutely horrified when they looked at it and said, oh, in the framework, where are things like shape, space and measure? Where's that gone? How do we do that now? And can I just say that in that document, if you look at the programs for learning, everything that we have always taught is still in there. And it's simply the parts of the curriculum that you add in that make the difference. So if you see the framework, and I look at it this way, the framework is a sort of coat hanger. It's going to give you the key pieces, the thing to hold it all together. What you put on it in terms of how beautifully you teach, how much you allow children to initiate their own learning, is actually up to you. So it's a chance, and I know there'll be people on the call today thinking, we've been doing topics for a long time, we've been doing themes, or we're trying out child-led learning. This is an actual moment in time when you can do it.
Okay, so that's nice. We've got child-led learning. I always like it if you can put a bit more specificity on there, because I mean, my teaching career came mainly in the top end of secondary. It always felt like it was child-led, no matter what I was trying to do, because in the end, it really relies on individuals' motivations coming from in the world. So, do you want to just give us some specificity on that?
Definitely. I mean, I think this is where the three documents tie together, really, because we've said for many, many years, and I used to work with QCO, the Qualifications Authority, when we first developed the foundation stage framework and the profile, one of the things we were allowed to say in those days was that 80% of what you know about children's learning and development should come from child-initiated learning, child-led learning, and only 20% from that you did as a direct adult interaction as a teacher, if you like. And when I say teacher, I'm sure there'll be learning assistants, teaching assistants on the call. Can I just say, for me, everyone is a teacher in early childhood. So that was what we used to be able to say. However, the government then at the time weren't very happy with that, because many people, and I'm not suggesting you don't understand it, Stephen, I know you do yourself a great disservice. Many people thought that by saying 80% of what children learn should come through child-initiated learning, there was an idea that would mean practitioners, teachers could just back off, sit at the back of the room with a coffee, it would all be fine, they'd carry on. And it was suggesting that we were making people lazy. That was actually said. Now, the same balance is there. So the majority of what you know about children's learning and development should come from children's self-initiated learning, guided by things that practitioners have introduced to the children, guided by a fabulous learning environment. By fabulous, I don't mean all the most expensive toys that you can buy, because I've seen people do far more with a tiny space with a tree outdoors in a really hot country where there's nothing than I have for people who've got money to burn and can buy everything. So if you keep in mind that the framework is your balance of your 80% child-initiated, 20% practitioner-led learning, what it should look like is that children are actually having opportunity to rehearse, to practice, not in a drill and skill way, but to actually pick up on things that fascinate them, that interest them. We've talked for many years about children's passions and interests. Well, this is a prime opportunity to do that. And there are some very subtle changes in the documents. And when we actually come to the main webinar, the depth of it, then I'll make sure that I provide some supporting documents so people have extra support to take away with them. But the emphasis is very much on allowing children to follow their own thoughts, follow their own ideas, and it's a scaffold for practitioners. But can I just pick up on the difference between a couple of these documents, Stephen, because we've had for many years the early years framework, and we've had the development matters. The development matters from 2012 morphed into something called the learning outcomes, which was basically all the development matters leading to the learning goal without the lovely pictures of the children in the document. So it was very straight, very cold. Many people hung on to the original development matters because it did something that the learning outcomes didn't. It still gave ideas of what practitioners might do, what the learning environment might look like, and also what to look for in terms of children's development. So that was the old one from 2012. We then had, and the framework, of course, accompanied it. We then had, or have at the moment, some people on the call may be using this, the early adopter framework and the earliest adopter profile. Now, they were not the final documents. There is now on the DFE website, if you go to gov.uk or dfe.gov.uk, you will find the new documents. So be very careful that you don't have the early adopter version, that you have the ones for full implementation in 2021. So there's no choice on this. They're coming in for 2021. So back to the middle document, which is the development guidance. That document is not statutory. The earliest framework is our statute. It's our curriculum, if you like, although it's very far from a curriculum. The development guidance has now been updated, but of course, I mean, you can't say that children develop in a different way now because it's 2021. Some of those steps are still there. So that document is a little more stark than it was. There is also a third document, again, non-statutory, called Birth to 5 Matters. Now, that document was produced by the Early Years Alliance in response to the new development matters, because many of the great and good, far greater than I and far more experienced and specialist in early childhood than I am, names that people would recognise, looked at the new development matters and said, that's not good enough. That's not going to support practitioners. It hasn't got the detail. It doesn't reference things like the sustainable goals. So I'm not going to say a rival document, an alternative document was produced for the sector, for the earlier sector, by the sector. Now that gives it quite a lot of clout, but I know people have been very, very confused by those two documents. Which one is it? Which one should we use? Should we use both? Now, in the main webinar, obviously, I'm going to go through those documents in detail, but my guidance at this point would be, have a look at all of them, read them from cover to cover. But actually, I think if you're a very experienced practitioner, you could use the development guidance, the new development guidance, as your framework, your framework for how children develop and learn. And then the Birth to 5 Matters would also support it because it's got fabulous detail in it. And it picks up, again, the steps of children's development. It also picks up what you could do in the learning environment and what practitioners could do. It's not dictatorial. It doesn't mean you've got to do that. But for less experienced practitioners, it's great guidance. If you're very experienced, I'd say use both. If you're not very experienced, probably stick with the framework and the development guidance for now, until you're confident with that, and then you can use the other supporting documents. Oh, and the Birth to 5 Matters also references the learning goals. So you've got it all in one place.
So there's a fair amount of repetition between these, but you've offered us a real go-to there and say, yeah, let's use that as the starting point. Yeah. Okay, that's cool. So where we go to next, will we look at the major differences?
Yeah, let me go through some bits and pieces for everyone. I mean, helpfully, one or two organisations have produced a version of the Early Years framework, your overview of learning programmes, the content, and they've actually produced versions where you can see highlighted all the major changes, which is very useful. So we can share that with people. One of the key changes is in terms of safeguarding, because this is a catch-all document that picks up safeguarding, ratios, it's a whole lot, as well as the learning programmes. So I think just to be aware of that, and I do have a document that picks up the main safeguarding changes. The most evident, I guess, change is the fact there's some changes in the language of the safeguarding. So things like should or may are now changed over. So where something before was a little bit more open, now it's trying to fine-tune the safeguarding aspects of it. So that's in the main framework. I've mentioned already that shape, space and measures doesn't appear in the main framework as a particular part of it, but it doesn't mean that you don't teach it. So if you read the programs, everything you need to know is in there. And people that I know are getting very worried about, we're going to have to throw out everything we've ever planned. No, you're not. It's just a drawing breath time to say, what exists from what we're doing at the moment that we really, really want to keep? What do we absolutely love? Right, let's look at that in the light of the new early years framework. And then once you've looked at those together, that will be much more effective in helping you decide what to do. As I said, the expected level has disappeared. That's not there anymore. We have emerging and exceeding levels disappeared. Emerging and expected we've still got. That, I think, isn't such a bad thing because, as I said previously, people got really hung up on the exceeding level. And because we weren't given a fabulous amount of guidance, there was an assumption that, children who'd exceeded the expected level, perhaps before they went into year 1, key stage 1, or just at that cusp, it was really difficult for practitioners to say, what should I be teaching now? How shall I support this child? And then for year 1 practitioners, whom you can't expect to be experts in the EYFS, although it's very good for people to talk to each other, because of that, they found it really hard to know where to go with these children, and sometimes pitched too high, sometimes didn't pitch high enough. So we stay with emerging and expected. And what I would say, if anybody here is a teacher of year one or even a head of school, just be aware that it's important that teachers in year one do know something about the early years profile and the early years framework, but also that if children are going into the next year group and they haven't yet achieved the learning goals, they must support the children who haven't to get to the point where they achieve them. Just in the same way that you would never receive a child from at the end of Key Stage 1 and say to them as they go into Key Stage 2, really sorry that you didn't finish Key Stage 1. We're going to pick up just here in the middle of Key Stage 2. You wouldn't do it. So it's really important. I know that's taxing because they are very different curricula. So it's to be very conscious of that. But you've got the support documents to go with it. The other thing that's interesting, when the framework was being trialled, and particularly when the profile was being trialled in the current situation, there was a lot of talk about self-regulation and executive function. And the idea was that there'd be some assessment of that. Happily, they've moved away from that now because, I mean, practitioners who are very well versed in self-regulation, executive function will know that they are very sophisticated aspects of behaviour, disposition and learning. And it's not something you can test. I don't know how I'm sure there are very sophisticated psychological tests, but I don't know how you do that as part of everything else you have to do in early childhood.
Yeah, it's not just the load on those. I mean, it's also the specific context that makes those ones very difficult. Number one to develop. It goes back to Carol Dweck's growth mindsets, actually, because you can't just have this generic growth mindset for everything. It's got to be at your moment of maximum adversity. Are you able to switch it on? Yeah. Which I think then comes back to the old traditional Chinese medicine approach, which is why it's so hard to measure, is because it works for every individual slightly differently at a different moment in time.
Absolutely, of course it does.
The complexity around these is enormous.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And then the other part of it, of course, is just to be being aware of all the areas of learning are still there. There are some very small changes, and again, they're more for the detail of the main webinar. But just to be very aware that when you're reading it through, you look at it in light of the old earliest framework. And as I said, we can send out a document that does that. So it's that, but it's also to be conscious that the characteristics of effective learning remain. I've had so many questions over the past few months of, so what do we do about the characteristics of effective learning? Well, they're still there. They're still a critical part of the early years foundations. They're a critical part of learning when you're 15, 21, 41. I still believe that you don't finish the characteristics of effective learning at the end of the foundation stage. But
although I've barely mentioned in the new Ofsted framework, which is kind of, but obviously fundamental to every stage of life.
Of course it is. And that's where the alternative development guidance, the Birth to 5 matters, is brilliant, because it really, really picks up the links between the areas of learning, the specific and prime areas, but also where the characteristics of effective learning are most visible, even though they are part and parcel of every mortal thing that children do in early childhood. So that's still an absolutely critical piece of it for the framework. And of course, they're picked up again in the profile. You still get to do your narrative, you still get to do your 2-year-old check, but it's just to be aware that there are some subtle changes, and the time spent on it now will be invaluable. And if people are going to join us in June for the next session, Stephen, I will make very sure that I go through that in great detail. And I think we're also going to say to people today, if people are reluctant to post questions that are relevant to this afternoon, if they want to just give us a steer of things they'd really like to have in the full session, then you go for it. I'm very happy to tailor according to that.
Thanks, Pam. That's brilliant. I'm just going to welcome Jacob in now before we get on to assessment and into other areas, because there's an awful lot to cover here.
Hello, everyone. Just as Pam was saying, she's joining us again on Wednesday, the 23rd of June at 4 p.m. And as she's been saying, for an in-depth dive into how you can practically implement the new EYFS frameworks in your settings. So bring your questions, bring your thoughts from today's webinar to that, and we'll answer it there. Now, to reserve your spot on this webinar, or if you want to find out more about what we're doing to support early years learning in your school, Our training specialist, Katie Cavill, has more details. If you're a senior leader and you're watching this webinar, then you qualify for a free training needs analysis with her, where she can discuss and analyze your development goals over the next year, as well as help you book your spot on the webinar. Now, I'm just going to drop a link to her calendar in the chat and pause for 30 seconds whilst you guys go ahead and book that free appointment. So I've just posted it there, and we'll just take a nice, quiet 30 seconds now. Wonderful. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks,
Okay,
Jake.
great. So we'll click on. Where are we best going? Are we best going to assessment? Start with the end in mind first, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me talk for a little bit about the reception baseline, because I know again that's something that people are concerned about, worried about. What should we do? Right at this moment in time, and I think I've said to you before, Stephen, I learned a lesson many years ago when we were doing face-to-face. Do you remember face-to-face sessions? A long time ago, when we were doing face-to-face sessions. I always preface what I'm about to say with, at this point that I'm going to say it, it is accurate. And I remember very well preparing for a keynote for the early years conference, having everything done, looking at my phone the next morning, just before I left for the conference, to find that the government had released a brand new document that threw everything sideways and having to do some very quick amendments. So I'm just prefacing this by saying this is what I know at this moment in time. So we have a new reception baseline to be fully implemented in September. And as far as I know, that is still going ahead. There's plenty of support and guidance for it on what they're calling the baseline e-portal, BEP, it's known as now. And there are training videos on there as well. So what we've got is, I guess, a simplified in terms of it's looking at math and literacy. Unsurprisingly, you would expect that, and that it's a piece of work that we are expected to do within the first 6 weeks of children starting school. But I would say that when we go through it in more detail, just a few words of, not warning, that would be very unfair, of caution. I'd certainly use the training videos, for whatever they're worth, but also there is some guidance on this. For example, we're told that it might be the children's class teacher that actually carries out this assessment. It could be a learning assistant, or it could be another practitioner who knows the child well. And they give the example of the Senko. Well, that's fine, provided that the child really does know the other adult. And I don't need to tell experienced people on this call today that children behave differently depending on who they're with. And if you've just started school, particularly for those children who, for example, didn't go to any nursery, you don't have a nursery on site if you're a school-based provision, may have come from another country, may have English as an additional language or a second language, may be very shy, may be very young. All of that together means that we already start without a level playing field. Now, the assessment is tablet or iPad based, and that's for the practitioner using it to do. There are also some activities for children to do, which have resources with them. But it is very much, once a child gets to a point at which they can no longer answer the question, or they find it very difficult, it is perhaps I shouldn't use this term, but it's a sudden death. That's it. The child doesn't go any further. And I think that needs to be very sensitively handled with children, because I defy anyone to say that young children don't know what's going on around them. So if you've been with your teacher or your assistant or the Senko for about the past 10 minutes, and you've had quite a long go at what the children will, I hope, view as a game, and you've been on it for 4 minutes and then you're done, something isn't right there. So it's got to be super sensitively handled. The guidance says that it will last about 20 minutes per child. And then, of course, we couple that with the guidance, which has always been, any assessment shouldn't take teachers, learning assistants away from the children for any length of time. Well, I don't know about the size of your classes, but I think you've got to think about that really carefully. And the timing of it is critical, yes, within the first 6 weeks. However, you've got to get used to it. You've got to practice. It's exactly the same as having a new phone, isn't it, or a new device. For the first few weeks, you're pretty ropey. Well, in my case, Stephen, I'm sure, I know you're very technically minded, so I'm sure you've got it in 5 minutes, but it takes me a long time. So if you're trying to get this assessment right and get to know your children and do everything that reception and nursery teachers have to do in the first few weeks, although it isn't a nursery baseline, of course, then I think, you've really got to plan for this very carefully. And actually, while I just mentioned nursery, can I just say that there's a part of me that worries about the reception baseline, not simply for the reasons I'm saying, but also because the indicators are that, right, we'll do a baseline now because you've had a lovely time in nursery and now we're going to start the proper stuff. I want nursery practitioners to feel incredibly valued because you've actually kick-started the whole thing if children have been to nursery. And again, I'm just going to flip back to the development matters for a moment, the new development matters, which for children from birth to 3 only has checkpoints. So I'll come on to that in a moment or two, but just to say that we've really got to, as reception teachers, value what comes from nursery and make the effort to have those discussions. So, as I said, it's tablet-based. It is a sudden death assessment, as sensitively handled as you can possibly manage it. Now, the idea is that there will be no league tables. It's not meant to be used to track, I was going to say track and trace then, haven't we changed our language, to track individual children at all. It is purely to give a sense of where children are coming into school in terms of math, in terms of literacy. And this is the interesting piece. The baseline document references very briefly Key Stage 1. It references Key Stage 2 hugely because the idea is that you have your baseline assessment in the first 6 weeks of school, and then the progress is measured at the end of Key Stage 2. Theoretically, nothing in between, but of course we have the early years profile in between. And that's to show value add, it's to show progress, it's to show how well schools are doing, how well children are doing. Now, it's a fond thought, but I'm guessing that anybody on this call now who has a lot of turbulence, a lot of children moving out of school, and particularly international schools, will say, well, actually, most of our children don't stay with us for more than about 3 or 4 years. It could be parents' relocation. It could be, they're maybe foster children. So that in itself has an issue with it. So let's see what happens with it though, Stephen, because I am old enough to remember, and I bet I'm the only one on the call who is, the very, very first baseline, many, many years ago, when all local authorities...
Oh, we've just lost Pam there for a second. I'm sure she'll be joining us in a moment. Just while we're there, I mean, there's a...
Right, don't worry, Stephen. It's just come back in. I'm sorry. Best laid plans of mice and men. There we go.
Just put you're on with your camera there.
Yes,
Nice.
Right, don't worry. I think it's where I am in the heart of the country. So there was an initial baseline. It's been through so many iterations. Every local authority produced one. This is in the early 2000s, and then people could choose from those baselines. And of course, you couldn't get a data set. If you've got 120 that came down to a possible 20 to choose from, then we had another iteration of it, which people will remember, I'm sure, in 2015. We had 6 providers produce them. 3 were chosen as the ones we could choose from. Everyone chose a different one. NFER were asked to do a study for us. Couldn't produce any data set because with 3 different baseline, how could you? And guess what? It's NFER who've written the latest one. Right. Could have been something to do with the price tag. Who am I to cast aspersions on that? But so they've done it. So it will be a data set that people can look at, but it's not an individual child's record at all.
Right. Okay. So hopefully that gives some clarity. If you've got any questions on this, please do ask away. I remember Dame Alison Peacock talking about this, and she said the danger of a race to the bottom. Has that been eliminated, or is that still a risk that it could be in schools' interest actually to score more scripted?
I still think, and it's a very delicate one, Stephen, because I wouldn't want to cast aspersions on schools. Heads are under enormous pressure. Absolutely. But I think you've got to report honestly. and even if it makes you look great at Key Stage 2, if your data's flawed and you know that, then that's not helping anyone. So I think you report it honestly, and it could be, that people will say, right, well, let's keep the scores low. I've actually heard people say, keep scores low, then we look better when we get to the end of Key Stage 1. However, there's such a long lead in to Key Stage 2. I'm hoping that people are just very honest. And can I just say something that, again, might be controversial? I'm not sure that information will tell you anything that you probably don't know about your children. You have to do it. However, if you're sensible and wise, you will also use the development guidance or the Birth to 5 Matters or a combination of the two as your base, and walking away from the second word, line. In other words, finding out where the children are in every area of learning so that you can really develop learning trajectories for them that are sensitive and respectful to children who are very, very young.
Okay, just before we get on to progressions and those sorts of things, because I know that's where we're obviously heading next. One question was, is the baseline obligatory in all reception, state and private sector?
It is in the state sector. If you're in the private sector, you can. I think I've forgotten the word. You deregister from it anyway if you're exempt. But some private schools are choosing to use it because they want to have not a league table. They want to have their own baseline data, because a lot of private schools, this is no disrespect, I work in private schools myself, are very data driven because of accountability. We're all accountable, but obviously if there are owners, external owners, if you're part of a group, then of course that makes a difference.
Okay, and if you're an international school, you're already using perhaps one of the commercial ones available.
Yeah.
Would you be doing this one as well? Would this be better?
I wouldn't. If you've got one already, a lot of schools use GL, the Granada Learning ones. Some schools still use PIPS. I wouldn't layer this on top. I don't think it's actually very similar to Granada Learning and PIPS. I'm sure they'd say, no, it's not. It's very different. But actually, there are a lot of similarities in it. A lot of similarities.
Fantastic. Okay, so should we get on to learning progressions and planning for those? And I think we'll end quickly on contextualization. So we plan to run this for we've only got about another 7 or 8 minutes going. So if you've got
everyone's saying, phew, that's great.
Ping the questions in. No, we need to tap into your expertise. So let's look at the learning progressions. And, is there anything different here in terms of processes? We look for us to determine the process?
Yes, there is, which is why, and please don't think I work for the Early Years Alliance. I don't work for the DfE either in that way. So I've got no bias other than what I think works well for children. I did refer to the fact that the new development guidance, the government development guidance, no longer has the month by month, the overlapping months of progress that we used to measure children's learning and development by. So those have gone. So you have birth to 3, you have bands actually, birth to 3, you've got the 3 to 4, 4 to 5, 5 to 6. You've got bands now rather than the overlapping months, which everybody found really useful, because of course, as well as I do that children don't develop in logical sequenced order. It just doesn't work that way. And there are checkpoints for birth to 3, not checklists. And I know that the current development matter, or the old development matters, had that little line on every single page that said, this should never be used as a checklist, as a tick list. The same thing still applies to the development matters, that it mustn't be used as a tick list or a checklist. It's checkpoints. And that's been a real struggle for practitioners who've trialed this, who work with birth to 3, because you need those demarcations. And that's where I think the birth to 5 matters is incredibly useful, because that does pick up. It still has the overlapping bands. It's given them the sort of the grades, but you can still see the birth and onwards, so that it's clear. And the way that the document's laid out makes it very easy to read. So that's why I'm saying, if you are an experienced practitioner and you're confident enough to support your colleagues to do that, the pieces in between that people worry about, the overlapping bands, are there in the birth to 5 matters. They're not there in the development matters. And they will help you to show children's progress. But I'm going to put this out there. I'm sure all the people who produce electronic tracking documents are crazily trying to get all this together. Just be aware, there was never an intention that up until the end of reception, the expected and emerging levels. That's it. So from baseline to the end of reception is when you would look at everything you know about the child against the emerging and expected levels, and it's still best fit. They have helpfully broken down the learning goals into sort of bullet pointed pieces, which is making people think they've got to tick them all off. You haven't. It's still best fit.
Is there any help from contextualization within this? Because I know that's been one of the criticisms of previous docs.
In terms of what, Stephen? What specifically?
So in terms of obviously different parts of the country, different areas, different needs, social layers of social deprivation, other areas which perhaps more efforts about. Is there anything?
I'd love to say yes. I think there is in the Birth to 5 Matters, and I know I'm sounding like an advocate for that now, but it's got all the detail in it, and it references the sustainable goals, the rights of the child. So yes, in that respect, but I still think there's a level of this which is quite Anglo-centric, and I know that one of the biggest criticisms that the Early Years Alliance raised, which is why they went to their document, is support for children learning English as an additional language isn't fabulous there. So I think, that there are other strategies that we may have to work with. I said at the beginning, you can make this framework and this curriculum fit in any jurisdiction. You can sit it alongside lots of schools, maybe schools on today that use the PYP, they use their own national curriculum. The development aspects of it still fit within somebody else's curriculum. And lots of schools that use the PYP and the enhanced PYP from the IB programs still use the Early Years framework profile against that because it's easier to see children's progress.
So I guess we're just layering up the detail with this new one as well. So
absolutely.
A lot more straightforward, right? So what would you say would be the practical first steps? If you're sitting there, you've got to implement it by 2021. We don't quite yet know some of the things that you've already mentioned there. But as a guest, I've got now between now and July, for instance, maybe early July, maybe end of June, to start getting all this in prep. Where would you start?
This is the simplest thing. And if I had $10 for every time I've said this about any document, is take the 3 documents, or take all of them, take the profile, take the framework to start with, sit down and read it from cover to cover. Now that seems the simplest thing in the world, and people say, of course we do it. No, I mean read it in depth. Hang on to it as if it's the best novel you've ever had, and read it from cover to cover, and then follow it with the development guidance. And then if you really feel you've got it, start to look at the Birth to 5 Matters. That's the only way that you will really get to know it. And if you've got, this is the time of year when people change jobs, etc., etc. If you're leading it, you read it first. People will dip into it, of course they will. And then know it well enough to calm people down and just say, right, let's look. And I said it at the very beginning, let's look at what we're doing now that we absolutely love. What do we not? What would we go to the wire to hang on to? Right. Now let's put that in the context of this new framework. And as I said, just because it doesn't say shape and space, just because it doesn't, just as an example, it doesn't say talk about rivers to children, you won't have a whole day where you talk about different waterways and say we can't talk about rivers because that comes in Key Stage 1. So read it and know it. Highlight that. I think this is helpful as well. If there are any bits of it that you think are ambiguous, just get your highlighter out and talk about it with your team. You could even take it one section at a time. This is the way that people run book clubs, isn't it, sometimes? Take one section at a time, everybody reads it, everybody comes back and talks about it. You've got the time to do that between now and July. So that's the best advice. Know what you've got to do for the baseline and what you might do alongside it, but knowing the documents. Years ago, I used to work for a head, and any new document that came into school, she had a pink highlighter. She used to highlight all the things in pink that she thought were the most important. And then she'd hand it to me as a deputy and say, there you go, Pam, your turn. I don't think I ever read a full document. I read the highlights. So I'm saying to you is don't do as I did. Do what I'm suggesting is the best guidance.
Thank you so much. Can you just ahead of you leaving, then obviously on the 23rd we're going to go through in a lot more detail. Do you want to just give people the highlights of what you'll be unpicking for them there?
Yeah.
Why this is going to what's going to be different from this one to that one? This is obviously
right. Okay. Number one, lots more depth, but the practical side of it. So here's the document. Here are some examples of the way that you might implement. Here's the way to make your life easier. Here's the way to make respectful opportunities for learning for children. Here's the best way to use the profile. And here, let's look at these two, development guidance and look at the birth to 5 hours. Let's look at those two together and see how we could dovetail them in and make it super, super practical. And I'm very happy, as I said, Stephen, if people have got things they think today, oh, please, for goodness sake, include that. Send it in. If anyone on the call has ever worked with me before, they'll know that that's my remit, is to say, I want to make this work for you. So, come with whatever it is that your school is struggling with, or you think you're struggling with between now and then, Stephen. I don't know if there's a platform for this, but when people have done, they'll read it cover to cover. They might think, oh, I really wish that webinar would cover this. And I'm happy to do that.
I'm sure with your expertise, you'll be picking up on those on the day anyway, Pam, and really pulling those apart. I think it's only as people really start to pull this apart and then work out the practical implementation, the practical implications for that these, the full practice will come. But in Pam's work with hundreds and maybe thousands of schools now, dissecting this and pulling it apart, but to make life easier for everyone. And I think the other fun one is if we get the planning in the moment kind of approach here, which I know you were alluding to earlier, because we've got a lot of big fans of Anna Effergrade here, but in the team as well. And it's how we pull those elements together. So, I mean, thank you so much for sharing with us that overview, the executive level one. Be grateful, looking forward to seeing you all on the 23rd. Thanks so much for joining us, and I hope that the planning goes well, the weather changes and becomes a bit fairer if you
Absolutely.
and you have a really great end to term, which doesn't involve any more lockdowns. So take care and thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thank you very much.